Thank you so much for joining us. We promise we will try our best to keep it lively because we recognize we're the after lunch shift. And so I'll just give a quick kickoff and then hand it to the main act here, which are my phenomenal panelists. But my name is Amy West. I'm the global head of ESG solutions for TD Securities. And it's a very exciting time, I think an interesting time really in the automotive sector, as we're seeing massive shifts take place when it comes to key technology, how things are transforming, and obviously an expanded electrified product offering. I think it's interesting because in the US alone, we now have over 117 electrified models in the market. And while EVs account for nearly 10% of sales, we're still on track to reach almost 25% of the market by 2030. So it's an exciting time. And I think massive investments obviously are still going to be needed to incorporate new technologies. Amidst some concern around the EV sales growth, which I think we can admit as we enter 2025. So today's panel is really designed to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that automakers and suppliers are going to be facing in the coming years, particularly as China doubles down on its strategy to gain an even larger market share of global vehicle production and sales. I also look forward to some differentiated perspectives on our panel today. Each panel member today really is meant to bring to this session a unique perspective. And there's no question, regardless of what anyone thinks about electrified vehicle offerings, they are going to continue to be a prevalent part of this market in the coming years. So important for policymakers, regulators, and investors. I think this is also, 5% of GDP? And so something that we have to take seriously in our national interest. So with that, I'd actually like to briefly introduce each of our four amazing panelists today, and I'll let each of them individually provide a little bit of an introduction and maybe a disclaimer. But first and foremost, and I'm going to get your last name terribly wrong here, Kristin Dziczek. Close?
Kristin's fine.
Kristin, who is a policy advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, but based in Michigan. We have Richard Russell. Thank you for having an easy-to-say name, Richard, who is with the National Mining Association. Joe Pittel, which is with Samsung SDI America, and Darcy Bisset with Hogan Lovells. So maybe I'll start here. Kristin, can you tell us a little bit about what you do? Your role?
Sure. So I'm the Automotive Advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. In that role, I am paid to worry about the auto industry, which is a great job for me. I'm really good at worrying. So, we're looking at all of the things that impact this, 5% of GDP, and, movements in markets, movements in, the manufacturers that are in our district, but even more than that, we work with the board of governors folks as well who do the industrials forecasting to help them understand, technology developments, workforce developments, labor union developments, all sorts of things, and trade is coming back onto the plate. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I have to give the disclaimer that I speak only for myself and not for Jerome Powell or any of my friends at the bank. So with that, I can.
Perfect, Richard.
Thank you. So I'm Richard Russell. I'm Senior Vice President for Government Affairs for the National Mining Association. We represent all domestic mining, both hard rock and energy, coal. We care very deeply, obviously, about the future of EVs, since one of the drivers behind EVs is actually having the materials necessary to make batteries. It takes about 6 times as much mined product to make an EV as it does to make a traditional vehicle. And so the two notions of having a significant EV production in the US and having significant domestic mining sort of go hand in hand. So excited to be here today. Look forward to talk about the various issues that are important to mining going forward. There's a lot of excitement about mining in the US, and I think that's going to continue.
And I'm Joe Pittel. I'm the General Counsel and Vice President for Public Affairs for Samsung SDI. Samsung SDI is Samsung's battery making affiliate. We're originally based in San Jose, but we relocated our headquarters to Auburn Hills to support the XEV explosion, and now maybe chasm and soon to be exploding again. I'm a Michigander, although I was relocated to DC last month after recent events at the urging of our CEO. And I'm happy to be here because I think Well, in some of the comments, you talk a little bit about how the auto industry has changed in my lifetime in the 45 years since my dad worked at Chrysler. And it'll be interesting as we all discuss together how we can keep that momentum. So thank you for having me, and thank you, Amy, for hosting the panel.
I am Darcy Bisset. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells, which is a law firm. I work in our energy and projects group. So I grew up as a renewable energy project attorney. I have since sort of moved with our Hogan Lovells leading automotive transactions team to representing both investors and manufacturers in electric vehicle infrastructure projects, charging infrastructure, as well as battery supply and supply chain issues. So very excited for this conversation. I also am a worrier, but I think I'm maybe feeling a little bit better these days than you are about where things are headed.
Than yours.
No, I just dyed mine last week.
So we're going to have some questions that can be individually geared, but for the group, I'd be curious, and jump in. What do you see as the most exciting aspect? There's obviously a lot of concerns, a lot of worries, but what's the most exciting aspect of the automotive sector right now? And then I'll also ask, though, what do you see as the biggest challenge in the next 2 years? And we wouldn't mind having some differentiated answers so we don't all say the same biggest challenge.
Well, I guess I'll go. I think the most exciting is we really have a lot of cool product. I mean, what I've been able to see and drive, there's cool product, compelling tech, lots of really, interesting rethinking of how we manufacture things. We're getting features into cars that people have wanted for a long time. I know one of my relatives just bought a new car and they're like, I didn't know it could do that. Like, I would have done this sooner. So I think, we do have a really a wide range of products that meet a lot of people's needs, and, a wide range of propulsion systems that meet people's needs. My biggest challenges, and this, comes from my view at the Fed, is it's not always affordable. And, people don't want cheap, they want value, they want affordable, and they have to, most places in this country need a car to get to work. And affordability is a big, big challenge for us right now. And the other thing, I think, for the next couple of years is we're already behind in some technologies, and we're in catch-up mode, and the world will not stand still if we decide to take it slow. So we will be even more behind, and that plays especially to the development of the supply chain, to development of charging, all of the things that we need to have in place for this industry to move forward and be part of the global industry.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely on the notion of not falling behind, and I think that is something that is going to take a lot of work going forward. Supply chains are absolutely critical if we're going to have, a continuation of growth, which we're seeing in EVs. I guess it's just a question of how quickly EVs will grow. And part of that, there's no question, revolves around the willingness for the American public to adopt EVs. And certainly part of that, at least with a good section of the citizenry of our country, is based on whether or not they think that EVs are good for the country. And the whole "Made in America" is an important component. What we love to say is "Made in America is mined in America." There are only two ways you can actually get consumer goods. You can grow them, or you can mine them. There's no other way of getting something that you can sell to a consumer. And if we're not doing the mining domestically, we're entirely reliant on foreign supply chains, which increase cost and also add both a political component to the question of EVs, which I think is unnecessary. When we're importing a lot of goods from China, I don't think that that's attractive to a broad cross-section of the American public. And the other issue is obviously if we're relying entirely on imported goods, then we also don't have control over the long-term economics of the EVs. And so we are very much excited about the prospect of being a critical component of the supply chain for EVs, having domestic mining do that. And we really think that that's going to happen over time. There's a lot of excitement for mining in the U.S. And there are a lot of minerals here. I mean, I think people don't fully appreciate just how much, how good our geology is. We have more copper than Canada and Australia combined. We have twice as much lithium as Australia. The stuff exists. It's just a matter of whether we're going to spend time and effort to make it and do it domestically.
And Richard, I'm eager to buy it from you because when I think of, again, my last personal story, but I grew up in Detroit. My dad was an auto worker, and he was scared to death that I would fall into the auto vortex of a dying industry. Now, fast forward 30 years, and what I'm excited about is that for the first time in my life, we're competing for workers. We're actually, I saw Mr. Messer from the MEDC here, and one of the things we used to talk about with Director Messer is how we've diversified our economy in Michigan so much that we're competing for workers. We can't find them. So that's exciting to me, that we're in the midst of this renaissance. What scares me, or I guess a revolution even, what scares me is like renaissances and revolutions, they're fragile at times. And what we've seen now is the fragility of this revolution. We've made great progress. First of all, 10% of the vehicles are EVs, which if you would ask people maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago, they would have thought that was maybe a difficult number to reach. So we'll all acknowledge that maybe the curve is flattening a bit. But the fact that we got this far is incredible. And if you've driven, I know you're from Indiana. Did you say you're from Indiana? Who's from Indiana? You're from Indiana. Drive to Indiana and go to Kokomo, where you'll see a 3 million square foot battery factory. This is not hypothetical. We're putting that up. We're launching next month. That's 2,800 Hoosiers that are doing what? Auto jobs. And where Kokomo, where 10 years ago was on a lifeline, losing transmission. So that's where I see the opportunity. And like so many things, our biggest opportunities are our biggest risks.
Yeah, and I'll say, I know you mentioned innovation in terms of what's available now. For me, again, I'm a projects person, so what gets me really excited is new technologies that are just launching. So, some of the newer battery technologies, Richard, obviously, we're going to need so many more domestically mined minerals, in the medium and even long term, but we know we have to get newer technologies and batteries out there too, and it's really fun to just see the number of different solutions that are, on the table and being worked on, and that's a lot of fun for me. But yeah, short term, I think supply chain is going to be the issue, both in terms of just getting enough minerals from anywhere, and then also trade concerns around China, et cetera, which I know we'll talk about. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, let's actually dive in on a supply chain comment. I actually have a question for you, Kristin. Since we have you here as the economist of the group, has the automotive sector recovered from the COVID pandemic? And then just to tie it into supply chain, there were obviously a lot of supply chains disruptions that caused huge production imbalances and record prices for new vehicles. Maybe you could just give us a quick update on that.
Sure. So we went through a lot in the last few years. I mean, as people, as an industry, everything stood on its head. And I hope we're better prepared for the next pandemic that comes, because there will be one. But after every disruption, after, a fire at a resin supplier, after tsunamis, after floods, after every disruption that this industry has, we adjust and there's a new normal. Sales and production are both at about 90-92% of what they were averaging 5 years before COVID. So not quite back. Employment, however, is higher in the industry in total than it was in any year since 2006. So employment's up, which is a good thing. Prices are still about 10 to 15% higher, not something we really want to see. Incentives are slowly rising that help bring that price into control. And everybody everywhere is working on cost. The cost of the battery, the cost of the rest of the car, the cost of manufacturing is top of everyone's minds. Suppliers tell me there's still a lot of schedule variance month to month. They get a firm release 6 months out, and that is not firm at all. It is jello. And sometimes the firm release, even a week or two before the next month's production is to start, is not very firm either. So I think we still have a lot of wonkiness in the system. One of the things about that I want to come back to on supply chain after my colleagues had just talked about it. John Bozzella and I had a conversation, I don't know, a year or so ago, and he wrote it up as if we go too slow in the EV adoption, we're going to be dependent on other supply chains because there won't be an economic drive to build it here. If we go too fast, we're going to be reliant on everyone else's supply chain because there won't be enough time to build it here. So we're looking for a Goldilocks pace of building out a supply chain, making sure those mines are economic to run. You can bring a mine up, but then if the price of that mineral falls, it's not economic to produce those materials here. So, this is one of the fragilities to our EV supply chain that worries me is the pace of development of these investments and whether we can sustain those developments over time.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there.
Yep.
I can already tell, Richard, that you've got a number of things to say here. So anyone can answer this, but maybe I'll start with you. What are your thoughts about the role for market barriers or protections when it comes to advancing U.S. competitiveness? And maybe I'll actually ask the follow-on to that, which is, are they enough to ensure the U.S. succeeds in the coming years?
It's a major issue, obviously, and what we're seeing right now, there's no question that a variety of countries, really China and Russia, have been dumping product on the global market, radically changing the price of mined goods. And so, and obviously, they're smart about it, and they do it at times that matter, which have actually closed down mines. There's a great example, and this is Russia dumping, although frequently it's China. Stillwater in Montana mine had to lay off 700 people in Montana. That's a lot of people. They mined palladium. Price of palladium collapsed, and they put out, I give them huge credit, they've actually put out a press release and explained why they were shutting down. And it was Russian dumping. And also another issue associated with that is policy. And in this case, the current administration has been very slow in ensuring that certain supply chain related tax credits actually apply to mining. We tend to say that the supply chain starts at the ground up. And unfortunately, the current administration sometimes thinks it starts later up the food chain. And that makes it very difficult because obviously without the inputs, it's very hard to have a secure supply chain. But there's no question that both Russia and China, and particularly China, dump a lot of product on the global market and dramatically change prices, which has a huge impact on the profitability of mines. And obviously, mining is a long-term commitment of capital. You can't, decide one day that you're going to mine and then next day you're not, and then next day you're going to mine again, because you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of sunk capital investment. And so it's really important that we create some mechanism to prevent those kind of fluctuations that are not market driven. And one of the nice things, we've worked very closely with the China Select Committee in the House side, and on a bipartisan basis, they're going to release in the next couple weeks legislation that attempts to create sort of a price floor to counter some forms of dumping. It's going to be marked as a discussion draft because it's very complicated to do it right. But it's a good jumping off point to start the discussion, figure out what we can do in terms of legislation. And obviously, we're going to be working very closely with the incoming administration to see what can be done to make sure that you don't have the kind of price fluctuations that knock otherwise competitive mines out.
But I do think we want to set protections so that we encourage domestic mining and domestic manufacturing of components. We also, though, need to be careful. In the solar industry, as a parallel, what we saw was efforts to protect the U.S. solar panel manufacturing industry, sort of ground the whole solar project development in the U.S. to a halt for a while because there was so much uncertainty about short-term supply of projects that were currently under construction. So we kind of need to do both, right? We need to protect we need to protect U.S. mining, but we also need to make sure that we don't stop our whole pipeline of manufacturing while we're waiting to get, a fully domestic set of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Set of
Joe, do you want to
supplies.
hop in here? 'Cause
Yeah.
I think Samsung's actually made some pretty big investments in this space, both domestically and abroad.
We have, and we're going to invest, we're investing $9 billion in Indiana. That's $6 billion in Kokomo, and then with our joint venture with General Motors, another $3 billion, and that's considerable investment, obviously. And my observation is that the market is not acting efficiently. I'm not going to try to out-economist the economist, but the point is that, and I don't think we should try to out-China China. That's a race to the bottom. So we have to deploy all the solutions in our toolbox. Let's bring up a sensible solution like 45X, which, by the way, has a runway, right? It's not forever. It's meant to protect in the short term, to do what Kristin mentioned is the catch up, because we are behind in the battery manufacturing situation. 45X is critically important to the battery manufacturers because it allows for an offset against the dumping that's happening in China. By the way, China has got too much capacity right now because their EV market is flattening just like ours. So there's more batteries on the market, it's pushing prices down, which is tough for a startup. We're not a startup, but we're starting up next month. And so we have huge capital costs that are on the front end. The other, and I appreciate what Richard was saying about, doing things on the policy level. We could spend trillions and trillions of dollars. They'll just outspend us in the near term. And so we have to protect intellectual property. We have to, make sure we're understanding the importance of national security in this space, not just, in terms of weapons of war, but we're talking about not having what we had in 2020, which was a supply chain totally reliant on a strategic rival. So the solutions have to be varied. It has to be every solution in the toolbox. And I brought up the fragility of this revolution because, the big fear was with policy fluctuations, there could be a pause in investment. But, we're maybe facing something scarier, which is a pause turns into capital that's been spent that cannot be recouped. It goes into a different type of economic situation. So if I sound like there's a sense of urgency in my voice, that's because I believe there is.
So I'm going to ask one controversial question, which, we'll make sure the audience stays awake, which is, and any of you can answer this. I won't just make it Kristin who has to disclaim her comments.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Just dovetail off of what was just said. So, and I'm glad you brought up 45X because that's a wonderful example. So one of the issues with a program like 45X is that the administration decided that it wasn't going to apply to mining. Then after the Stillwater shut down, they decided it was going to apply to just integrated mining. So you actually had to do processing in order to get it. Those are the kind of programs that if you fix them so they apply all the way down the chain, we think they could be really useful. And the other thing is, though, that you got to make sure that we're not incentivizing import from countries like China at the same time. So those kind of programs actually can work extremely well, but they actually have to be fixed, we believe, so that they actually apply to mining. The other issue is that, it's not just dumping. It's also withholding product. I mean, today's announcement on gallium and germanium, and I'm sure that's not a particularly healthy announcement for you guys, that the Chinese are going to withhold the export, shows you how fragile it is for us to be relying on the Chinese. And we used to mine both of those things in the U.S. And so it's not just a matter of us competing with the Chinese and they're dumping product on us. It's also that once they close down our mines, they can withhold product from us and we can no longer compete higher up the food chain making stuff that the American customer needs.
And nobody wants another OPEC. OPEC met 2 weeks ago to talk about doing something with oil, and it's kind of a yawn, right? Because we have enough oil in the system that we can withstand an OPEC shock, which used to cripple us in the 90s, 80s, and 70s.
So this is actually the perfect question to follow you, Rich, which is to the whole group. Do you think the elected officials and regulators even have a clear idea of the competition that's taking place in the automotive industry?
No.
In your private capacity.
I think I've got almost universal agreement on that. I spend a lot of time going out to see product, to go to teardown centers, to go to people who are benchmarking the product that's out there from everywhere. I've driven the Seagull, I drove the BYD Shark, like I've seen the Xiaoping and all these vehicles that are coming from China. I was in China in 2018, and I took my teenage son at the time. He was 13, really into cars, went around the car show, took pictures of, Mom, look at this, look at these panel gaps, look at these orange pearl paint, look at this. There's none of that anymore. These are really, really compelling products. Not always anything, whiz-bang fancy and technologically advanced, but very, very compelling products at a very incredible price point. I think, tariffs and industrial policy and investments and all of these things are all meant as sort of a protective wall. If you think about when the hurricanes came through earlier this year, there's this product called the Aqua Wall. They put it around the Tampa Bay Hospital out in the Bay. It goes up really quickly. It protected the hospital. The floodwaters recede, and the hospital is saved. Yay! Well, these are all seen as like the Aqua Wall for the industry, but the waters will not recede. And so you have to build up. We have to have technological innovation. We have to cut costs. We have to work really hard while under protection in order to, because it's not going to be there forever, although there's one tariff that's been in place almost as long as I've been alive. But they won't always be there forever. And so what we do in the time under protection is going to be really key.
Well said.
All right, Kristin, actually gonna ask you a follow-on to that, which is, I'd love your perspective on the manufacturing outlook, particularly as you see things right now, both in terms of the, as you pointed out, significant investments that have occurred in recent years, and then also thinking a little bit forward, what does that mean for U.S. auto manufacturing jobs, and what does it mean for the broader automotive supply chain?
Hi. We're in a real period of flux, and, like I said, everybody's attacking cost. There's also been a difficulty getting enough workers in many of our plants, and especially in engineering and higher tech jobs. If we have disruptions that put a chilling effect on immigration, including skilled immigration and H-1Bs, we're going to have some trouble. Manufacturing it drives on, the innovation, it drives on these investments, it drives on the market continuing to be there. One of my worries is that a new car is a luxury good. We categorize the industry into these, there's luxury, there's pickups, there's vans, and the luxury segment has grown a lot since COVID hit our shores. But for most people, that is an unaffordable, unattainable purchase. And the used car market's been very active. It's behaving fairly differently right now. But I think, we've been kind of chugging along at, a manufacturing pace and getting over all these disruptions. It's still fairly fragile, and the power of the consumer has been driving us, and we need to have a continued powerful consumer to get through and to sustain these changes. But I've also been out to a lot of automation firms recently. Many suppliers and automakers are automating processes for higher quality, for lower cost, for repeatability, and it's just incredible the kinds of things that can be done. But even the automation firms, the integrators and the producers of automation, have a lot of stuff sitting around right now, because it's like, well, that investment was planned, but it's been put on the shelf for a little while. I worry about aging out. I think you mentioned that earlier about things that have been planned, but then we might not get around to them in quite the time frame we were going to. There's suppliers that have told me they've got whole lines that they went out and committed to their customer, and those lines are sitting there shrink wrapped. They come to me and complain about rates. I'm not going to talk about rates, but there's a lot of risk in this system right now.
I'd love to dovetail off of one of the comments you made, Kristin, which is about workforce. Because for the mining sector, it's a huge issue. We have 36,000 jobs open in the mining sector in the U.S. right now. And, part of that is obviously because, mines tend not to be in urban areas, and so it's a little harder to attract workers. But these are high-paying jobs. They're long-term jobs if people are willing to stick with them. And most interestingly, only 15% of those jobs require a 4-year degree. So not only do we need engineers, but we also need people who can operate heavy machinery, who don't necessarily need to get a 4-year degree. And so it's a real challenge, and it's something that we spend a lot of time and effort on. Our companies all are very interested in doing a better job recruiting. But I think that's a major issue going forward across the manufacturing sector, but certainly in mining as well.
And Darcy, I do want to lean into your expertise here. I know you've been tracking investments in EV infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure, in fact. And we heard a little bit earlier today about how this has been challenging, particularly due to a lack of utilization at DC public fast charging stations. And I think, how do we recover those investments? Here, my question is really simple, which is just, where do you see these necessary investments in public charging in the future, knowing that the majority of charging generally right now is occurring at work or at home? And I know that that's also hard because not everyone has access to charging infrastructure. So would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm going to take that in reverse order.
Sure.
I have a couple open bets with different people in the industry about how use of fast chargers will change over time. I think level 2 charging works great as an almost exclusive solution for the kind of people who start their dishwasher every night and make their bed every morning. But that's not so many people, actually. And I think as EV adoption grows, I think, someone mentioned before the EV market moving into lower income levels where people might not have their own, driveways or garages. But I think we also might just get to less responsible people, let's be honest. And so I think that actually we are going to see over time that people start to rely more and more on fast charging. Also, as Andrew Cornelia mentioned earlier today, as charging becomes less of a hassle, that you sit and wait and think, oh my gosh, this is taking twice as long as gassing up, and it becomes more part of your cultural experience, part of, just the daily routine and how people live their day. So I am personally bullish on fast charging. I just think it needs a little bit more of a ramp up time and some better public messaging. In terms of investment, though, when we're talking about private capital, I think we're going to need some stepping stones for private capital before it becomes easy for private capital to invest solely or without government intervention in fast charging. I think it's going to happen with fleet investments first, and I think that's what we're seeing, right? That private capital will come first to charging in fleet. Charging for fleets to EV fleet operations, et cetera. And as people get comfortable with that, both from a business perspective of seeing the returns come through, and also as more consumers, maybe even if they don't have their own EV, if they're interacting with an EV on a work basis, that it will become a lower risk proposition in general. And that's, I think, when private capital will be more ready to enter into a fully consumer reliant high-powered charging investment.
I'd like to go back to the first question.
Sure.
I suddenly feel
Are you
more
going to take my
optimistic.
bet?
Yeah, I'm with you there. You know what occurred to me as I was listening to Richard and I was listening to Kristin and Darcy? We know what the consumer wants, right? We know what the problems are. It's range, safety, the range anxiety, the safety, and the cost. I'm quite certain the people here in their various departments and the engineers, they're all working on those 3 problems. Once we get to solid state, safety is off the table. Range is improving each year, and the cost will improve. I guess we just need the time to get there so that we have an industry that can accomplish that goal. If we don't, the Chinese are killing us a little bit. If we could buy some time, we're going to get there. Once you get to 300 miles, under $30,000, you will sell. They will sell.
If I could jump on that, I mean, if this is something I talked about at a conference I run, I have an annual automotive conference in Detroit. If you want to come, it's first week in February. But last year we talked about, every new product introduction has, the cutting edge, the bleeding edge people, and then we get to the mass market. The mass market consumer for autos doesn't put up with anything wonky. It needs to do what their existing vehicle does and be better. So it has to be cost competitive. We've talked about that. Has to be convenience competitive. I don't have to think too much about driving from Detroit to Chicago, or I'm going to spend a little bit of time in your fair state of Indiana, waiting before I hit the Dan Ryan, because I don't want to do that. It is understandable that we're seeing slowed growth as we move into this next phase. It's the marketing theories on this is around 15 to 16% of the market will be early adopters, and then that next phase of folks really needs everything to work. So we don't have a robust charging network, public charging network everywhere.
It's not as bad as we think it is. Come on, we were all told we're supposed to be messaging this better.
Yes, it's not as bad as we think it is, but it's not there enough for consumers to feel confident about it, even though they're going to charge at home mostly, and they're not going to take very many 200, 300-mile trips. They still want all of that to be there in that vehicle. So it's a no-compromise leap to this mass market, and it's going to take time, as Joe was telling. It's going to take time.
As a shameless capitalist, I will say one of the things I'm excited about, excited is maybe the wrong word, is, we've talked already today about climate change and the way that is affecting people's daily lives and uncertainty around natural disasters, et cetera. One of the key ways that I see EVs potentially becoming not just a replacement for an ICE, but something better than, is their potential to act as a sort of charger for the home in a short-term natural disaster scenario. And I think, again, we're not quite there yet, but I think we can get there pretty quickly, and that could change the math dramatically, because then you're not just buying a car, you're buying a car and a generator.
So I want to come back to one thing you said, Joe, if it's okay. You mentioned all the manufacturing you're doing in the U.S., and we've talked about competitiveness and needing the time to really bring the cost down and be competitive. How critical is it for Samsung, or even other suppliers, in your opinion, or manufacturers who are investing here, to ensure that there's certainty with these tax incentives, with these production tax credits? And, I'd love to understand how you guys think about those decisions. Do they spur those decisions to establish your manufacturing presence here, in your opinion?
Absolutely, they absolutely, and again, it's not hypothetical. You could see after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and some of those tax incentives. Before I left to come here from Michigan, I have this map in my office, and I did a quick count. I think I counted 18 or 19 investments, big plants in maybe 10 states: Kansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. So it's not hypothetical, and those tax credits are critical. And I like to point out that 45X has a runway. It's not supposed to be a permanent thing. It's supposed to be that temporary bridge to get the ramp up done so that we can compete on the global market, because we are behind. And I didn't get the memo that we were supposed to be more positive. So for the remaining 17 minutes,
I just nominated myself.
I'm very positive.
Yeah.
I'm very positive.
I also want to tease one thing out, and Richard, I'm going to ask this for you. We've talked a lot about, we do have to be mindful of the capital and investment community and making sure that there's funding coming to this. But I also recognize that from your seat in mining, there might sometimes be different priorities between your members and some suppliers or automakers even, as we think about this space. So I'd be curious, where do you see alignment, or maybe calling it differently, regulatory certainty, or some of the signals that you're watching that, for those people in the audience that are part of the investment community, how should we think about support for greater domestic extraction? Or what's a process you're watching that maybe isn't going to be realized for a few years?
So one of the reasons I'm here today is we actually have a wonderful working relationship with Autos Innovate, and they're very supportive of our efforts to bring regulatory certainty to mineral production in the U.S., because there's a direct correlation between that and supply chains and EVs going forward. And so, we've partnered with battery manufacturers, we've partnered with the auto industry on a whole host of bills and comments to the federal government about mechanisms to increase certainty associated with mining. One of the biggest areas by far right now is anything associated with getting permitting done for individual projects. There's an issue right now that we're trying to deal with legislatively, which the auto industry has been supportive of as well, which basically there was a errant court decision which decided that tailings weren't part of mining. It's pretty hard to mine without tailings. So we need to fix that legislatively. And the partnership on that has been fabulous. And so we got that through the House. It's in the Senate permitting bill. And that's because there's been a very broad consensus that we actually do need to mine domestically. And so we really appreciate that partnership. Obviously, ultimately, all of our members sell their product and they want as high a price as possible. And battery community, auto community wants as low a price as possible. Makes perfect sense. But that's the nature of capitalism and markets. We're fine with that. It's the other impediments that are unnecessary and ultimately raise costs for everyone that I think we can partner on.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, of course, commercially, we would love to have the mine in the United States. Who wants our stuff on a boat for 6 months? We don't want to bring it across the border. And so, we're supporting our supply chain, not just for security and not just for predictability purposes, because in the long run, we think it makes commercial sense.
So let's tease out. We've talked around it. We've talked about it. Let's talk a little bit about that global nature of the industry. A little bit deep dive on China's role in the markets. And I'm going to direct this question to Darcy, but as always, jump in if you want to make a comment on this. I'm kind of feeling like Kristin's going to jump in on this one. China's influence on EV battery manufacturing is obvious. So I'd love to get from your perspective, because you are a little uniquely positioned in your seat, to share some of the trends you're seeing. Like, how are we seeing companies, how are you seeing clients work on addressing their supply chain so that they're not as reliant solely on foreign entities and the concerns that brings?
Yeah, so I think, as you said before, it's using all of the tools in the tool belt. So, clearly we're seeing a lot of investments directly in mining operations and focus on domestic mining, et cetera, trying to get domestic supply chain building, internal factories in the U.S. But I think we also need to look at, in the short term, we have to find a way to play nicely with those Chinese companies that are holding the intellectual property we need, but in a way that is compliant with FEOC regulations, et cetera. So what we're seeing is a lot of joint venture adjacent discussions that definitely are not joint ventures, where the Chinese entity definitely does not have any control, but they might have some economic rights that look a little bit like they're in control. So I think we're going to have to be innovative from a legal and commercial perspective, just in how we structure transactions for domestic facilities in the coming years, so that we are able to appropriately incentivize Chinese companies to work with us to help us through the hump. But I guess I'll turn that over to you, since you're really living it.
My colleague Paul Dorsey's here, and we had fun with the word salad of control and whatever regulation that was, Paul, right, Paul? Paul? See Paul here? He's
I
not
like how the light is shining directly
poor guy. It's right on him.
as you call him out in the
So
audience.
I could not agree with you more, but that was a real challenge, wasn't it? To figure out, if it's 6 layers down and,
Yeah. It's fun.
Totally. And then that is one of the challenges. And by the way, even despite our best efforts to decouple with China, we're not going to be able to decouple with China in the next months. It's going to take some time.
Yeah. We can do a support group at happy hour later.
That starts early, actually, at 4, so it's a good,
Yeah, there we
good
go.
start. Richard, I'd love your view on this. share with us a look under the hood here. What concerns do your members have regarding the high concentration of critical minerals being extracted and processing even that's under Chinese control? Obviously they're then going to be utilized in EVs for this, but I'd be curious also about the sourcing opportunities that exist here in the U.S. You talked a little bit about lithium, copper, which I didn't know how much we had. I would love to just hear more about that. How can the U.S. really meet these needs as we work to put up the aqua wall, buy us time, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge problem, and it's not just because China is a main competitor of ours. It's also because if you look around the world where China or Chinese-controlled companies are mining, they're not doing it in a ecologically friendly or quite frankly humanitarian manner. And so I think we have a responsibility not to get sucked into that, and the companies that are members of NMA all care very deeply about how they mine. And so obviously in this country we have very strict rules about reclamation and environmental laws and labor standards. And the companies that are our members use similar rules across the world, even if the country they're in doesn't necessarily share those very strict standards. They ensure that they promote those strict standards because they want to be good corporate citizens. And you look at a lot of what's going on in Africa with Chinese-backed mining, and none of those rules apply. So I think there's not only a strategic element to this, there's also a human element to this, and there's an environmental element to this. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what we need to do is be a little more clever about how we look at things like mining. If we care about the environment, as I was just saying, we don't want to simply offshore mining to Chinese companies in Africa. That doesn't help the environment. And I think that over time, I think there's going to be a broader realization. I sort of find it akin to what's happened over time with nuclear power. If you actually look at the split in terms of political support for nuclear power, it used to be that basically Republicans supported nuclear power, Democrats didn't. Now, a vast majority of Democrats support nuclear power. And I think you're going to find that true with mining as well. And certainly that's the direction we're trying to push. We obviously have more support on the Republican side than on the Democrat side. But we definitely have a growing number of Democrats who are very supportive of mining, especially Democrats from states where a lot of mining takes place. And I think in order to actually get to extraction, the one thing we need to re-inject into the process is certainty. The biggest problem in the U.S. for miners is that, if you go through the permitting process, you check all the boxes, you finally make it to the end, then you get sued. And so that's another 10 years, right? And that just doesn't work. And so, the average time now from start to startup, from the time you envision building a mine to the time you actually start it up, is 29 years. That's not tenable. And so we're working very hard to shorten that and make it rational, because otherwise we're just not going to be able to produce all the things we need.
That is an absolutely stunning figure. 29?
What is rational in the view of the miners?
Well, obviously it's site dependent, but it's certainly not 29 years. At that point, you're not. I would say to start with, we have an awful lot of mines which either aren't opening or aren't running full on because of various permitting concerns, and to begin with, we should just address those, because that's a very easy fix in theory. But you got to have the willingness of both Congress and the administration. And the Biden administration has been a little schizophrenic on mining. The Department of Energy likes mining because it likes minerals, because it likes EVs. The Department of Interior doesn't like to mine on federal lands, and it controls huge swaths of federal lands that have the minerals. And so it's very hard to reconcile those two positions. I do think that the incoming administration is going to be much more open to actually allowing multiple use on multiple use lands.
So we do have this great panel. I know we're coming up on time of subject matter experts. So as we wrap up, I want to ask and get each of your perspectives and end it on a bit of a broad note. What are a few key themes or indicators that you each individually will be specifically looking at, not in the immediate term, but over the next 5 years, regarding the state of the automotive market and the EV market and maybe even the supply chains in the US? And I know Richard's just going to say be rational, but give me your broad strokes thematics. Maybe we start with you, Darcy.
Yeah, so I think there will be continuing convergence among the automotive and energy industries on the pain points for both, and I think there's opportunity for sort of shared collaboration and lobbying there, particularly around electric transmission infrastructure, right? We need it for EV charging, but even more than that, we need it for data centers. And so there's broad push in both the energy and the automotive industries now to push that those transmission networks forward and do the necessary infrastructure work. And then also with mining, as energy storage also becomes more prevalent in the utility scale energy world, there's going to be competition for critical minerals there too. So I think there's going to be increasing convergence of those worlds, which I also think will change sort of transaction structures. That's mine.
Yeah, on the commercial side, I think our OEM customers are already looking at their product mixes and the type of electrification. I think there was a feeling it was going to go from ICE to BEV to battery electric, and I think wisely our OEM customers are looking at other platforms. So for a company like ours, it's incumbent for us to be flexible with our solutions in terms of what we can offer. If they want to switch, seeing that the customer, like we said, we know what the customer is worried about. Then the question shifts to what the customer really wants. And while sometimes our OEM customers might not get it perfectly, they generally get it right, because they have a 100-year history of doing that. That's on the commercial side. On the policy side, I like what Richard was saying about the consistency. Nothing makes any business in any environment more anxious than a whiplash of uncertainty in terms of policy. So if we're advocating for anything is a consistent approach, that means that if there's going to be tweaks, they should be subtle, not wholesale hack jobs. I guess someone used the term a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer or whatever. So I think that's the two things. We got to be flexible on the commercial side to respond to what the customer actually wants, and on the government side, we have to try just not to screw it up.
So first, I'm really optimistic because the call for minerals is going to be enormous going forward. I mean, regardless of the actual rate of adoption of EVs, you talked about battery storage. I mean, there's a lot. There's huge need going forward, and I think we can meet a lot of that need domestically if we just have some rational policies, and that means access to federal land, that means rationalizing the permitting system, that means having a rational approach to countries that are dumping product onto the global market. So I did do exactly what you said I would.
So I'm going to venture into something a little scary here, I guess. How many of you would volunteer to drive in a blizzard? Like you see a blizzard out there and you're like, I'm going for a ride. I'm going to go drive in it. That sounds like fun. Not many people. Our industry is driving through a storm. And everything is swirling all around us. Things are changing. But one ray of optimism for me, and this is going to sound weird, is that our political shifts are every 4 to 8 years. We're not having these shifts that are 12, 16 years where you go along a path and then it's often said a pendulum swings back. This is more of a metronome. It goes one way and then goes exactly the opposite way in almost the same degree. But because we keep going back and forth, we are sort of moving forward at the base. So it's predictable that we're going to swing one way. It's predictable that if another party takes a political office, that they're going to swing the other way. So we want certainty. We want stable policy. Well, I think you have to look into the instability is the stability. Like that this is predictable. We're going to go this way. We're going to go that way. And then, in the end, you have to steer through the storm.
I like the metronome. I might use that.
It's not a pendulum because pendulums swing slower and they get to the middle and that doesn't happen.
Well, it is incumbent on me to say first thank you to these wonderful panelists who will be available after this for questions. We're not going to do Q&A in the room, but they'll be available out. And I just thank you for coming. We're now going to have a 15-minute break so that everybody can get coffee for the afternoon session before our next panel on 5G automotive innovation and connectivity. So thank you, everybody.